Yeah, I'm just going to have a quick chat with Daren about how his experience of using data both as a player and as a broadcaster, and how the game has changed and how we've helped sort of accelerate that change, I guess, and yeah, your own experiences of it. So obviously as a player, you made your debut sort of 96, 97 time, played right through to 2012, so you're in that generation that had experience both pre and post depth at the T20. From a data perspective, how different were things from the beginning of your career to the end of your career?
So before I answer that question, I'd just like to congratulate CricViz on the opening of its new office here in India. I know many of you might be more keen to look at what's happening with that IPL game. But just to answer your question, Patrick, you're right. Starting my cricket career in the 90s was very different to when it unfolded in the 2000s, and there was a massive difference in terms of the information that we got as players. My memory tells me that in the late 90s we had what was called a video analyst, which is very different from a data analyst. So this video analyst was someone who traveled with us and captured video clips of our performances, whether you're a bowler, batter in the field, and we use that type of analysis in our planning, in our team meetings prior to matches. So that's just the basic of basics. So if you wanted to see something technically, you went to the video analyst, you got information, you tried to share that information with the coach. It's done jointly. You work on developing your proficiency as a player, and then that slowly changed to us having the data, meaning we were able to tell now what an opposition bowler was able to do, what type of delivery that bowler was using to get many of his wickets, where batters were scoring many of their runs. So in essence, you had a direct guide to strategies before you started playing. Now mind you, not all the time those strategies work. So there was a sort of balance that we had to strike with the information that we got. But I just want to share one story of a player who I played alongside, who I think was ahead of his time with regard to data, and that's Brian Lara. So Brian Lara was a player who was in our dressing room, in my team, who I was very close to, who back in the 90s had this brilliant mind of crunching numbers and paying attention to numbers. And many of the times when he spoke about his batting, he would speak about opposition bowlers, what their capabilities were, which particular delivery in an over they were trying to do what. And his, I don't know if that's his, or one of his genius as a player, he was able to stay ahead of the opposition, whether it was a batter or a bowler, with his attention to detail and the numbers. So as a captain, he would say exactly what a particular batter will do when he gets to 20 or 30. And when I kind of connect the dots now, having information in front of me, I think, you know, Brian was ahead of his time with regard to processing information, but even before that, capturing information, processing it, and using it to his advantage as a player. So massive difference from the 90s to now, and I think the game is much richer for the information that we have, and that's for all stakeholders.
So it sounds like, would it be fair to say that it's gone from being more of an individual thing to more like what it used to be, you go to video analysts and look at specific parts of your own game? It's kind of transitioned slightly to being more of a sort of team strategy thing around.
Yeah, I mean, it works both ways. As a player, you're happy to see what your strengths are, what your deficiencies are. It gives you a guide to where your area of focus should be. But collectively now, even when you're playing against an opposition, you know that there are no secrets. An opposition is aware that in the first 10 balls that you face, your strike rate is 115, but from the 11th ball to the 25th ball, you switch into a different gear where you're striking at 140. So as a captain now, a captain is more inclined to using a less sort of reputable bowler at the start of an innings when a player arrives. So you have that sort of competition happening with the information even before the game is actually unfolding. And I find that very fascinating. That to me is the most enriching part of the game, where you can take information, develop strategies, try to counter opposition strategies, and then when you go to play the game, the conditions will just pack all those things aside and make it moot. So it just adds to the drama of the game of cricket, and you're right. You have the opportunity, whatever stakeholder you are, whether you're in broadcast, whether you're a player, whether you're a captain, whether you're an analyst, you have information now that you can use for the betterment of your role and the betterment of the game of cricket.
So when you were a player, do you remember any? Sorry, when you were a player, do you remember any specific example of early bits of analysis that you came up against from opponents, or you only mentioned Lara as one of your teammates, but things like matchups are obviously such a buzzword in the analytics industry now. Was there any kind of early example of that you came across?
Very much so. I can remember this series we were playing against, two examples I'll give. We were playing against Australia 2003 in the Caribbean, and McGrath and they were bowling towards us in that first test match in Guyana at Border, and we had an Australian contingent of coaches, Bennett King and a few other coaches from Australia. And after that game finished, he was very quick in telling the entire team what was going to happen in the very next game. So myself and Lara scored runs in that game, and many of the runs that we scored in that game were off the front foot. We were driving a lot of the ball. Border is usually a very flat, docile pitch, so bowlers tend to pitch the ball up, trying to bowl wicket to wicket. So we got a lot of runs scoring off the front foot. Very rare they will go short at us. And Bennett King was the first one to come to us at the end of that test and say, listen, you know, when we get to the Queen's Park Oval, those 2 days of practice that we have, we're going to try and work on scoring off short ball, because these guys are going to come with a totally different strategy to counter us and to curb your scoring, because they'll look at your wagon wheel and they'll know that you've scored 80% of your runs through cover and mid-wicket. They're going to try to make you score square of the wicket in that next test match. So don't let them jump you. Prep yourself for that approach from Australia. And back then we were still sifting our way out with a data analytics person in our team. So we still had the video analyst, but that video analyst wasn't giving us this sort of information. But because of the background of Bennett King as a coach, here it was, he was introducing this sort of, I would say, proactiveness from us as players to think about what's going to come next. Don't just turn up in a test match to play and respond and react to what is being thrown at you. So that's one. The other one that is very, very specific that a lot of you might relate to was during the inaugural, not the inaugural Champions League tournament. I think it was the 2011 Champions League, if I'm not mistaken. So Trinidad and Tobago was a team that I captained in that tournament. And we were playing against New South Wales in Chennai. It so happened Chennai was the Chennai back then, low, slow, helpful for spinners. And we only got about 140, 150 or so, very low scoring game. And we were defending this game. The game went down to a super over, they call it an eliminator back then. So Simon Catich was the captain of New South Wales, I was the captain of Trinidad and Tobago. Here it was, Ravi Rampal couldn't defend 17, I think, of the last over, so we ended up in an eliminator. So I had to make the decision as to whether to bowl Ravi Rampal, whether to bowl Sunil Narine. Conditions were quite dewy, so when speaking to Sunil Narine, he was telling me that he was struggling to grip the ball. He even struggled during the main game. I could have turned to Kevin Cooper, he had a side strain. So I went for my trusted experienced bowler in Ravi Rampal. What did New South Wales do? They went for a guy called Steve O'Keefe, which is a left-arm spinner. So I found that very strange, that they just went, out of the box and went for a spinner. So long story short, we lost that game. So I went across and I spoke to Simon Catch. I said, Simon, what prompted you to go with O'Keefe as a spin option? He said, Daren, our data analytics person pulled up the amount of runs scored against fast bowlers as compared to the runs scored against spinners, and it was a big distinction. So we went purely on the data that we had. And that was like mind-boggling for me, because back then we didn't even have a support like that. But it kind of like opened my mind to the fact that, hey, It is not the genius in a captain to come up with that and to have that clairvoyance or gut instinct. The information is there. How you use it, you can use it to your advantage for success.
Yeah, 100%. And especially looking at the scorecard of that game, it was Moses Enriquez, who I think was taking the
Correct,
yes. So you probably prefer to spin to him.
Yes, correct.
So anyway, since your retirement, you're obviously regular in commentary boxes around the world now. Have you felt a significant shift in the way that data is used in a broadcast sense since you've transitioned to that career?
Of course. Like I was saying previously, there are commentators who still trying to wrap their heads around data and how to use the data. There are commentators who are sold hook, line, and sinker. I mean, Ian Bishop is one of my very close friends who is very much a data person. He loves the numbers, he loves the matchups. He knows that, you know, it is a secret that is being shared, because persons who tell you today that they play the sport at the highest level and they don't use data, they're not being honest with you, because every single dressing room, every single auction table, there is an element of data that is being used for decision making. Most captains too. If a captain tells you he doesn't look at the numbers, then he's not worth his salt, or he's just giving you something that, you know, he doesn't want to tell you the truth. It's the ideal guide for you as a captain. I'm not saying that you've got to use that information all the time, but the information is there. You've got to find a way of striking that equilibrium. And to get back to that question of yours, of course I use that, and many commentators use the data that we get. I was saying, during this IPL, the preview of an IPL match, when it comes to the data and the information prior to a match, it's a 30-page document that you get as a commentator with information on every single player. Players' strengths, players' weaknesses, what the player has achieved in this season, what the player has achieved. You try to take a 3 to 4 year sort of sample size of time to get a more realistic inkling of that player and that player's ability and production of runs and performances. It's fascinating, because what it allows you to do, it allows you to project as well, because you know many captains are looking at these numbers. So as a commentator, I can say for sure that, you know, beyond the power play, we would see Adil Rashid bowl, because you very rarely see Adil Rashid bowl in the first 6 overs. And you have many examples of that. So you can straight away tell the viewer and forecast, this is going to happen, and it comes across like magic, because the person listening and that spectator watching on, who probably doesn't process the numbers and follow the game with such a deep intent, saying, wow, Daren Ganga knows what he's talking about. But this time I'm being guided by the data and the information. So it works both ways. And then at other times, you have players and captains who go on their gut instinct. And you might pitch the numbers, and then the captain does the total opposite, and the total opposite works. And there it is, as a commentator, you now have to temper the way that you use the numbers as well. You've got to still understand that there's a human element to the game, and the game is not played on automation, that there will always be that human element, that distraction that will shape the game in a different dimension away from the numbers. So for my own use of the numbers, it's brilliant, but I try to find an equilibrium in the way I use that in broadcasting. And it works for me, and I think, you know, if I had any advice to any persons doing commentary, is make sure that you incorporate the numbers and the data in the way you prepare to commentate, and the way you sort of broadcast the game to the viewership.
Cool. Just one final question before we throw it open to the room. But going forward, how do you see the broadcast landscape changing in terms of data? Do you have any strong opinions on where it's likely to go?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying with the equilibrium side of things. I mean, I don't want to call any network name or anything like that, but sometimes if you're looking at a sport and you're looking at a preview show, you're looking at a mid show, you're looking at a post show, sometimes if you have too many things being discussed in too short a space of time, you get confused as a viewer. And I think the game has to preserve the entertainment value as well. The game can't just be a game of numbers. So as much as players use the data to play the game, I really want to see broadcasters use the numbers in a selective manner. And I've said this before, the greatest challenge for me as a broadcaster with all the data that is available is to pick the right one for the right sort of passage of time in the game. And that to me is the essence of good broadcasting and where I would like data to be used. I really feel with the amount of franchise tournaments and the fact that players are being called and demanded in different spheres, the way you describe a player, the way you analyze a player is becoming more and more important. So data being used for that sort of player analysis when you sit around an auction table, I feel there's much more to be done from a broadcasting point of view in terms of the stories behind teams, franchise teams, and how they go about selecting players. I think Mumbai Indians had a Netflix series where there was a snapshot as to how they went about doing it. I think from a broadcaster's point of view, from where I sit, I would love to see the story behind an RCB going through the process of selecting their side at a major auction. You know, in 3 years' time, what's that process like? Who are the minds behind that? That could be a documentary, it could be a series, it could be a mid-inning show. I would like to see more of that behind the scenes action happening, or maybe in the dressing room too. In Premiership football, we now see and hear coaches talking to their teams halfway through a game and talking the strategy and the analysis. Maybe that's going to be fascinating for the spectatorship to see what is happening during the halftime of a game, how a coach is interacting with players, of course in an environment that is controlled, but that deeper insight is where I want to see the data being used and being shown and being broadcasted to a wider viewership.
Sounds like we just commissioned Freddie Wild the movie then, so before we leave we'll get that sorted and signed off. Brilliant, well thanks for that. Just want to open the room up a little bit.